Asaph's hands trembled as he held his son's cold body. The 20-year-old had been executed that morning by corrupt judges who demanded bribes the family couldn't afford. What kind of God allows his chosen people to suffer under such twisted justice? The temple singer's voice, once strong enough to lead thousands in worship, now broke with rage and grief. The judges who killed his boy weren't just corrupt. They were something else entirely. Something that made Asaph's skin crawl every time he saw them whispering prayers to gods whose names shouldn't be spoken in Israel. Ancient sources suggest these weren't mere idol worshippers. They were servants of something far more dangerous. That night, Asaph couldn't sleep. He walked through Jerusalem's empty streets, past houses where other families mourned their own losses, to the same corrupt system. His mind kept circling back to a disturbing pattern. Every nation around Israel seemed to have the same problem. Rulers who started righteous but became monsters. Justice systems that protected the wicked while crushing the innocent. It was as if some invisible force was orchestrating the corruption. Asaph had spent 40 years serving in God's temple. He knew the scriptures better than most priests, stories the rabbis didn't like to discuss, references in ancient texts that made even scholars uncomfortable. What if the corruption wasn't random? What if it was part of something bigger? Something that traced back to the very foundations of human civilization? The temple archives held texts that few were allowed to read. Asaph's position as David's chief musician gave him access to scrolls that contained uncomfortable truths about the spiritual world. As dawn broke, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find out who really controlled the judges who murdered his son. The first scroll he opened made his blood run cold. It was a copy of an ancient text that described the division of nations after the Tower of Babel. According to this forbidden account, when God scattered humanity across the earth, He didn't just abandon them to their own devices. He assigned spiritual beings to govern each people group. These weren't angels in the way most people understood them. They were Elohim, divine council members given actual authority over human affairs. Asaph's heart raced as he read further. The Hebrew word Elohim didn't just mean God, the Creator. It was a category that included any being from the spiritual realm. The Most High had created a cosmic administrative system, delegating authority over the nations to lesser divine beings, while keeping Israel for Himself. But what happened when those divine administrators stopped following orders? The scroll describes something that made Asaph's hands shake. These spiritual governors had begun demanding worship from their assigned peoples. Instead of pointing humans toward the true God, they had set themselves up as rival deities. They craved the devotion that belonged only to the Most High. And they were willing to corrupt every system of justice, every form of government, every structure of power to get it. Suddenly, everything made sense. The judges who killed his son weren't just greedy humans. They were servants of fallen divine beings who ruled through fear, corruption, and the perversion of justice. Asaph felt sick as he realized the scope of what he was discovering. This wasn't just about Israel. Every nation on earth was under the control of rebellious spiritual entities who had turned their backs on God's purposes. But if this was true, what hope was there? How could mere humans fight against divine beings with actual authority over earthly governments? Asaph felt the weight of despair settling over him like a burial shroud. Had God abandoned his creation to these corrupt spiritual tyrants? Was there no justice left in the universe? That's when the vision came. Asaph found himself standing in a vast courtroom that stretched beyond the limits of sight. The architecture was impossible, built from light and sound rather than stone and wood. At the center sat a throne that radiated authority so pure it made the sun look dim. And on that throne sat the Most High God, his face set in righteous anger that made Asaph's soul tremble. Before the throne stood the rebellious Elohim. These weren't the terrifying monsters Asaph had imagined. They looked almost human, but with an otherworldly beauty that made it clear they were far more than mortal. Their eyes held the cold arrogance of beings who had convinced themselves they deserved worship. Some wore crowns that represented earthly kingdoms. Others carried symbols of the false religions they had established. God's voice when he spoke was like thunder rolling across mountains. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? The divine council members flinched, but their pride kept them standing tall. They had grown used to being worshipped by humans. They had forgotten what it felt like to stand before true authority. Asaph watched in amazement as God continued his indictment. These beings were supposed to give justice to the weak and fatherless. They were meant to maintain the rights of the afflicted and destitute. Their job was to rescue the weak and needy from the hands of the wicked. Instead, they had become the source of wickedness themselves. "Gives justice to the weak and the fatherless," God commanded, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic law. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. But Asaph could see in their faces that these fallen beings had no intention of obeying. They had tasted the sweetness of human worship and found it more intoxicating than obedience to their Creator. God's next words shook the foundations of heaven itself. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. The corrupt spiritual rulers had become so blind to truth that their rebellion was literally destabilizing the world. Every act of injustice, every corrupt judgment, every perverted law was sending shock waves through the very fabric of creation. Then came the verdict that changed everything. I said, "You're gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince." The words hit the rebellious Elohim like physical blows. Their faces went white with terror as they realized what God had just pronounced. They were being stripped of their immortality. These beings who had ruled nations for millennia were going to die like the humans they had oppressed. Asaph felt a surge of fierce joy as he watched the arrogant council members crumble. The spiritual tyrants who had corrupted his nation's judges were receiving the same judgment they had dispensed. To innocents, like his son, divine justice was being served at the highest level of reality. But the vision wasn't over. As the condemned Elohim were led away to face their execution, God turned his attention to the future. Asaph heard him speak words that would echo through history. "Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations." The corrupt spiritual administrators were being removed. God himself would take direct control of every people group on earth. When the vision ended, Asaph found himself back in the temple archives, tears streaming down his face. But these weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of hope. His son's death hadn't been meaningless. It was part of a cosmic story of justice that would eventually sweep away every corrupt system, every perverted law, every twisted judgment. Asaph picked up his writing materials and began to craft the words that would become Psalm 82. He wrote not as a theologian explaining doctrine, but as a witness recording what he had seen in heaven's courtroom. Every line carried the weight of personal experience, the authority of someone who had glimpsed the ultimate source of earthly corruption, and its divine solution. The psalm he wrote that day would be read by people living under corrupt governments for thousands of years. They would recognize their own struggles in his words. They would understand that the injustice they faced had spiritual roots that went deeper than human greed or political ambition. When people read Asaph's psalm today, they're reading the testimony of a father who lost his son to spiritual corruption, but discovered that God's justice operates on a timeline bigger than human lifespans. They're connecting with a man who learned that every prayer for justice, every cry for righteousness, every demand for truth is joining a cosmic chorus that began in heaven's courtroom and will only end when God inherits all the nations as he promised. The corruption that killed Asaph's son is still active in our world. The fallen Elohim may be under divine sentence, but their execution hasn't arrived yet. Every unjust law, every corrupt official, every perverted system of justice carries the fingerprints of spiritual beings who chose rebellion over righteousness. But their time is running out. And when justice finally comes, it won't just be human criminals who face judgment. The spiritual powers behind earthly corruption will discover what Asaph witnessed in his vision. They will learn that there is one throne in the universe that no amount of rebellion can overthrow. They will face the God who said they would die like mortals, and they will find out he always keeps his promises.